Once again, I would like to reiterate how much I really appreciate being invited to come out here and both enjoy Bermuda as well as get to talk about something that I've been exploring for the better part of the past 10 years. And that's how Bermuda, Bermudians, and the wider British Empire, United States grappled with the changing Atlantic world, both during and immediately after the American Revolution. So to begin my talk with, the American Revolution's division of the British Empire transformed Bermuda into a strategic military asset, crucial for challenging the United States and Americans' identity in the Atlantic. American patriot officials, specifically Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, argued that by annexing Bermuda in 1775, 1776, an independent United States could extend its authority further into the Atlantic and secure its maritime frontier and commerce from future British and foreign attacks. Yet American designs fell apart during the American Revolution, and the island emerged as a critical border region from which the British Empire pivoted to secure its position and suppress American citizens' identities in the Atlantic. In the years between the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, Bermudians deepened their dependency on the 13 mainland colonies for commercial trade, income, and provisions that the agriculture-poor island could not produce. These dependencies, coupled with Bermudians' lack of strong commercial and military connections with Britain at the time, ultimately led them to aid the revolutionary American patriots against the British metropole during the early years of the American Revolution. Through assisting American patriot forces in acquiring their colony's munitions stores on August 14th of 1775, they formed part of a sphere of influence for the 13 colonies that, although minor in scope compared with Britain's hold on its American colonies at large, did extend eastward into the Atlantic. Bermuda embodied a vulnerable Atlantic zone, though, a gray border region that was capable of being turned by the increased presence of the British Royal Navy. Revolutionary American officials, understanding this reality, emerges in Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane's communications with Congress in 1775 and 1776, as I briefly alluded to moments ago. Franklin and Deane understood Britain's continued presence in and around the North American continent constituted a primary threat to a long-term American independence project. The possibility of poorly defined border zones surrounding the nascent United States allowed Britain to undermine Americans' relationship with neighboring British and European colonists, and as well as Native American nations in the interior. But Britain's continued control of Bermuda, Franklin and Deane determined, posed a threat to American merchant shipping and any post-war Anglo-American peace. To deter this outcome, Deane called on the Continental Army in 1776 to invade Bermuda and fortify it against British attack. In addition to the Continental Congress authorizing funds to be approved for the invasion and defense of the island, Franklin attempted as well to win American control of the island colony through various treaties and peace negotiations with France and Britain, advocating that the United States help claim to the island in his sketch for the Proposition of Peace with General William Howe and the Treaty of Alliance of 1778 with France. Here in Bermuda, St. George Tucker, as well as the Tucker family, also attempted to convince General George Washington to invade the colony to secure Bermudian American trade, as well as Bermuda's independence from Britain. But fears of turning the island against the United States came to fruition as Britain attempted to bring Bermuda firmly within the metropole sphere and strengthen the Royal Navy's fortifications and exert stronger political and economic control after the Revolution. See if I can advance that. Yeah. Just sort of a summary of the main points and arguments. The post-war economic optimism that emerges in 1783 transcended the divisions going on within Bermudian society that began to form during about the midpoint of the American Revolution, which can be seen in increasing Bermudian privateering operations against American merchant shipping, as well as ongoing smuggling operations that continue to assist the American patriots. Governor William Brown in 1783, 1784 and 5, a loyalist and former justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court who replaced George Brewer Jr. in 1783, maintained an optimistic outlook for Bermudians' post-war commercial fortunes, but grounded his position on the decidedly loyalist and imperial conclusions. Glossing over Bermudians' propensity for illicit trade and support for the American patriots, Brown proffered reassurances to Whitehall and King George III that different principles, opinions, and wishes would, quote, now prevail in the colony. A spirit of loyalism and commercial optimism gripped the island as the inhabitants realized that the United States' separation from the empire unalterably decided, and provided a new means of employment and prospects for profit. Despite Governor Brown's optimism for the island's economic prospects, he took a far more measured and continued approach and cautious approach to maintaining the colony within the empire. The governor requested a contingent of the king's troops to be permanently stationed on Bermuda in case the islanders decided to rekindle, quote, their affinity for their American brethren. The British government concurred with this position, since they believed Bermudians had become, quote, too vital to be, they believed that Bermuda had, quote, become too vital to be left in the hands of mere Bermudians, end quote, and embraced a colonial and military policy designed to make Bermuda, quote, the Gibraltar of the Western Hemisphere. The importance of securing Bermuda's commercial sea lanes and imperial position neighboring the United States also emerges in Lord Dunmore's meditations on the island's strategic significance in the wake of the American Revolution and U.S. independence. On November 22nd, 1785, Dunmore penned a letter to an unknown author, but it's speculated widely by scholars that this is Lord Gower, about rumors of his possible appointment as Bermuda's governor. He asserted that Bermuda's position in the Western Atlantic made it one of the most significant islands in the British dominions outside the British Isles themselves. There is no spot of sand belonging to His Majesty, Dunmore confidently claimed, of half the consequence to the welfare of the trade of this country. That island must be, were we at war with either France, Spain, or the United States. Faced with the United States as a new potential threat to British authority and dominance in the Western Atlantic, British officials began restoring Bermuda's garrison and fortifications to active service in 1789. Bermuda's military revival reversed the British government's previous decision to disband the island's garrison forces in 1783 that had been in position during much of the American Revolution. Similar to the Bahamas, refurbished existing constructing new fortifications, barracks, and military facilities aimed to project Britain's authority and strength to both the previously patriot sympathizing populace as well as Britain's rivals in the Western Atlantic. The Royal Navy, to help strengthen its position at the island, commissioned Thomas Hurd, a hydrographer, to survey and chart Bermuda's waters, as well as engineer Captain Andrew Drumford to inspect and modernize the forts and coastal defenses. The project for sounding and charting Bermuda's reefs and channels took Hurd and his team of enslaved Black pilots 5 years to complete on the island, and I believe another 4 years for the actual printing and manufacturing of the map for the Admiralty. It's actually quite an extensive thing, quite an impressive thing to see. I think a couple years ago, the Royal Gazette printed an article on the Hurd map, which included a digital image of it, which I can't provide here at this particular moment, but it is a sizable 12-foot by 20-foot map with incredible detail on the reef structure and system of the surrounding island and channels. And this was important for the Navy to create because it placed a greater importance on understanding Bermuda's reefs and channel system for naval use. Consequently, the Admiralty spared no expense for Hurd's survey because he and his pilots produced, as I just mentioned, one of the largest and most detailed maps of the colony's underwater topography at the cost at that time of approximately 12,517 pounds. So quite extensive for creating a single map. Hurd's new chart of Bermuda's harbors, channels, and sounds revealed several deep water channels that Britain's large ships of the line could navigate, such as the HMS Resolution, which I believe at the time was a first-rate ship and what was used by the Navy to actually test out the channel to put it here into the Great Sound, and prove that they could actually move in a large fleet inside and around Bermuda. Furthermore, the sounding of the bays and harbors lining the Great and Little Sounds on Bermuda's western end, like out here at Ireland Island, discovered a bay called Grassy Bay, adjacent to Ireland Island, capable of sheltering a naval fleet. In the summer of 1783, with the news of an imminent peace between Great Britain and the United States, Bermuda's merchants and mariners speculated on how it would improve their lives and commercial fortunes. Colonel Henry Tucker provided an optimistic outlook on Bermuda's fortunes and He envisioned a new role for Bermuda as a free port that bridged the Atlantic to connect an independent United States with the British Empire. Continuing, he hoped, Bermuda's pre-revolutionary war economy in a divided Anglophone Atlantic. Tucker believed that this would rest on changing the island from being merely a colony within Britain's mercantilist economic system to a British free port, colonial free port in the middle of the North Atlantic. An optimistic Henry Tucker believed that designating Bermuda as an economic free port would maintain the island and remake it into the, quote, storehouse of the Western world and be worth more than half a dozen Caribbean islands. A Bermudian free port would relax customs duties and regulations on goods traded to and between Britain and the United States. It also stood to benefit the Tuckers personally, as well as their merchant associates financially, because they would be able to conduct business as they had prior to the American Revolution, with Bermuda serving as a commercial gateway in the Atlantic world. A continuation of the North American trade in peacetime also stood to recoup financial losses incurred from lost or plundered ships that a lot of the patriots sympathizing Bermudians encountered during the American Revolution. Yet the reorganization of the British Atlantic world permanently broke apart Bermuda's commercial trade network. The Bermudian commercial empire lost access to its forest commons in what was British East Florida, but now was taken over once again by Imperial Spain, where the islanders harvested timber for shipbuilding, and new loyalist settlers pushed the islanders out of their traditional salt-breaking territory on the Turks and Caicos Islands. High tonnage rates imposed by the United States against British vessels also hurt Bermudian merchants and commercial shipping. As a result, the colony expanded its military complex. As a result of the colony's expanding military complex that begins taking place in the late 1780s, early 1790s, and then into the early 19th century, this came to place a lot of this traditional maritime commercial employment and seafaring as a primary source of Bermuda's economy, and Bermudian families and businesses increasingly became dependent on the Royal Navy for income and employment. One such early example is Joseph Stockdale's pamphlet, The Plan for the Establishment of a Marine Academy, that was printed in January 24th of 1794. In this pamphlet, Stockdale lays out a general plan and appeal to develop an institution for the instruction of youth to be founded on the island of Bermuda. Bermudian and other colonial boys would be broadly educated in professional maritime trades, anywhere from masonry and surveying, but also more educated subjects like mathematics, sciences, geography, astronomy, nautical architecture, as well as the French and Spanish languages. Bermuda's location and the establishment of a marine society, marine academy, would be an ideal location for training colonial youths for service in the Royal Navy, both ashore in the dockyards and on board warships at sea. The Marine Academy and its professionally educated sailors would prove to be a great benefit to His Majesty's service, Stockdale claimed. The marine commerce of Great Britain and of great convenience to the West India Islands and the North American colonies under protection of the parent state. A Marine Academy's establishment, if permitted, would make it the first of its kind in any British colony, and with an academy situated between Britain's Canadian and Caribbean possessions, it would afford their inhabitants the opportunity of educating their sons closer to home without incurring a much greater expense of sending them to Britain to be trained in the naval academies there. Furthermore, the island afforded shelter for British cruisers and armed ships, best adapted for harassing merchant vessels and frigates from all countries of enmity with Great Britain. The specification that British and Bermudian warships could hide and annoy ships traveling from settlements in northern and southern American colonies or the West Indies belies the reality that while Britain was at peace with France, Spain, and the United States in about the mid 1790s, this would not always be the case. While the British government's plans for a Bermuda naval station were in their embryonic stages, Bermudians increasingly turned to the continuation of the American Revolution's privateering operations against American merchant ships to acquire income and supplies that were being hampered by the new trade barriers that emerged from the United States' departure from the British Empire. Notable privateers include Bermudian Hezekiah Frith and the loyalist transplant British Goodrich, who brought in thousands of pounds sterling in prize money by condemning ships through Bermuda's Vice Admiralty Court and establishing themselves as prominent members of Bermuda's post-revolutionary society. Loyalist privateer Bridger Goodrich, his brother William, Father John, and brother-in-law Robert Sheldon, who lost their homes and much of their property when they fled Virginia and the American Patriot forces during the Revolution. The Goodrich family captured and impounded over £1 million sterling worth of merchant ships and cargo during the Revolution. Privateering wealth and success facilitated the Goodrich family's integration into Bermudian society, particularly as their support for the British government placed them in a more favorable position of influence during a loyalist governorship, such as that of William Brown and Lieutenant Henry Hamilton in the 1780s and 1790s. Hezekiah Frith and his sloop Fanny and Betsy also gained notoriety for their privateering operations along the coast of French Saint-Domingue, while Frith targeted French merchant ships, neutral vessels carrying French cargoes believed to be destined for ports outside of their home country, were viewed as aiding and abetting, while Britain was at war with revolutionary France and thus were liable to seizure by Bermudian privateers. Many of the American ships caught by Frith and his fellow Bermudian privateers were claimed to be conducting such a practice. In 1795, as one example, Frith gained a degree of unfavorable publicity, let's say, in the American press for his capture of the brig Lydia from Baltimore, in which he confiscated over 22,000 pounds sterling worth of goods from the ship and its 59 passengers. Bermudian privateers aided in reasserting British maritime power in the Western Atlantic by harassing and diminishing the United States' maritime labor force and merchant fleets. Bermudian privateers, however, Bermudian privateering, however, was increasingly subsumed by the islanders' dependency on the Royal Navy and the naval station's construction, which began in earnest in 1809 for regular income and employment on the island. The increased British impressment and privateering operations off Bermuda and the Bahamas during the 1790s motivated the American Congress to ensure American sailors' identities, physical descriptions, and citizenship were well documented. One early instance includes appears in the case of the Somerset versus the HMS Argonaut. In August of 1795, an American merchant ship, the Somerset, was on return voyage from Bordeaux to New York when it was intercepted by the British warship HMS Argonaut, operating out of here in Bermuda. After boarding the Somerset and determining it carried a cargo of French goods, the British captain, John Alexander Ball, ordered all the vessels, crew, and passengers brought aboard the Argonaut, dispatched some of his men to the American ship to pilot into port in Bermuda, where he impounded the ship in the island's Vice Admiralty Court. Following several months of detention on Bermuda and the condemnation and sale of the Somerset's cargo, the American merchant vessel embarked for New York City, its home port, with only a skeleton crew that barely managed to sail the ship through the North Atlantic's icy water, winds, and freezing spray. Captain Ball only allowed 8 of its 13-man crew to return, while the other 5, consisting of 3 British-born sailors, a Russian and a, quote, black man, quote, hailing from Pennsylvania, remained in custody before being forcibly enlisted in the Royal Navy. Congress attempted to provide some counter security for these sailors by producing identity documents and a reporting structure and protocol for sea captains, merchant vessels, in the event of their being boarded and their sailors or passengers being forcibly taken by the Royal Navy and impressed. And they did this through an act called the Protection and Relief of Seamen Act of 1796. Yet these documents produced in accordance with this act, did little to deter the Royal Navy from harassing and boarding American merchant vessels in the Western Atlantic. British officers challenged sailors' U.S. citizenship and oppressed American seamen. By 1806, Britain's early and continued aggression out of Bermuda against Americans' property and rights necessitated both decisive political, diplomatic, and economic action by the United States government. And this begins a series of escalations on embargoing both Britain and France and enacting other continued trade restrictions until we get to about 1807. In June of 1807, with the Chesapeake and Leopard affair, where the HMS Leopard, stationed here at Bermuda, is patrolling around the Chesapeake looking for French ships that are running between the Caribbean or France and the United States and trying to suppress the French trade. And the Leopard manages to bottle up 2 of those ships in Chesapeake Bay. But over the course of these operations, there are former British sailors who leave the Royal Navy. And in this instance, a sailor known as Jenkin Radford, who was given sanctuary in the United States, but he joined the crew of the USS Chesapeake. But while he was on leave in Norfolk, Virginia, went about proceeding to harass a number of British officers who had come ashore there. And this sort of clues in the Leopard that there's this defecting absconded British sailor on the Chesapeake. And the Leopard proceeds to, when the Chesapeake goes out to see the Chesapeake, or the HMS Leopard sort of pursues them, gives chase, and attacks the ship in an effort to recapture Radford. And this particular incident gains a degree of notoriety in the American press. Thomas Jefferson, president of the United States at the time, launches a bunch of bellicose language against Britain for attacking an American warship, but ultimately doesn't really do much other than persuades Congress to enact the Embargo Act of 1807 that further restricts and expands upon the non-importation acts that preceded it in restricting trade against both Britain and France. But ultimately, the failure of the non-importation and the Embargo Acts to challenge and change British policies of impressment against American sailors continued harassment. This is an example of the Seaman Protection Document. Contributes to Congress and President James Madison's declaration of war against Britain in June 18th of 1812. And it's really here in the beginning of the War of 1812, that the British Royal Navy dockyard here at Bermuda and Britain's naval significance comes into earnest, into its own. The Royal Navy's fortifications in Bermuda enable British warships to challenge the United States' sovereignty by blockading the American trade in its eastern seaports and launching direct attacks against port cities and the federal capital of Washington, D.C. This emerged during the War of 1812, when the island served as a base for British military organization and launching its assault against Washington, D.C. and Baltimore in the months before the fleet set sail for its attack on the 1st of August, 1814. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane used Bermuda as a rallying point that consolidated ships, sailors, and a force of 5,000 soldiers and supplies drawn from Britain, Canada, and the Caribbean. While Bermuda had been central to Britain's intercolonial and transatlantic commerce for much of the 18th century, the War of 1812 emphasizes the island's developing role as central to Britain's naval power in the Atlantic, especially that its, quote, convenient situation contributed in a great measure to the success and activity of the squadron. This is Cockburn talking, which have not been equaled at any period of the war, end quote. Following the War of 1812, Bermuda's Royal Navy dockyards and base officially replaced Halifax, as we were discussing briefly in the last paper, as Britain's headquarters for the North American Naval Station in about 1818, 1819. The Bermuda base would later be expanded to include authority over the West Indies stations, as the island's location proved better situated to counter potential maritime challenges from the United States and more effectively bridge between the Canadian and Caribbean colonies in the Western Atlantic. By 1820, the British government had expanded the initial regiment of British troops into a series of sprawling dockyards, barracks, fortifications, and military storehouses across the island, much of which we can still see today. So to conclude, Bermuda's emergence as a part of the border sea region after the American Revolution reveals its strategic role as a place of refuge for both loyalists and for extending Britain's influence in the Western Atlantic via its naval power. Colonies such as Bermuda, the British metropole once considered of minor importance, gained new prominence due to their strategic location of resettlement and as points for countering new and emerging potential threats, such as the United States. Examining border sea island colonies, such as Bermuda, the fundamental transformation brought about by the American Revolution, the loyalist ex-diaspora, and the reevaluation of security and naval structures, as well as imperial policy in the Atlantic world becomes more evident. Thank you very much.